Welcome to Next Round with me, Dale McDermott.
And me, David W. Higgins.
A young Irish look at the economy, politics and society.
Covering home and abroad.
For the thinkers, the dreamers and the doers, this is Next Round. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Next Round. Today we want to talk about the hospitality sector with a number of high-profile restaurants in Dublin closing in recent months. We look at the VAT rate. Does the special 9% VAT rate need to return in order to support a supposedly struggling sector? We also look at population data which has come in from the CSO that shows the population of Ireland rose by 98,000 people, which is the largest 12-month increase since 2008. And finally, earnings data is out from the CSO as well, and it shows that earnings are up an average of 5.6% over the last 12 months. And with inflation down as well, what does that mean for potential first-time buyers and the wider economy as well? So a packed agenda. If you do like this podcast, please like, share and subscribe to us. You can also view the podcast on YouTube, where you can look at our channel there as well. We appreciate your support and look forward to building this community as we've been doing over the last number of months. So
Dale, you're back from holidays, is that right?
Well, David, I am back from holidays, which is, I had a wonderful week in Spain.
Super.
So I'm slightly tanned and sun-kissed, which is great, and looking forward to our conversation today. And given that I'm in hospitality mode, or at least coming back off it, I think it's a natural, nice place for us to start. And I think we want to talk about the wider sector here. We've seen, David, some high-profile restaurants closing in recent months. There is a debate around should the special VAT rate, which was 9% for the wider hospitality sector, should that return, given some of the pressures that this sector is facing, given that it's a sector which is really important for the Irish economy. But it's also a sector which is facing some questions recently. I'm going to reference Oasis, David, given that they have just announced their reunion tour. Have you got tickets, or will you be buying? Will you be buying tickets?
I might give it a go.
Okay.
But I do expect the tickets here to be a bit like gold dust. So YouGov did a poll of British adults and asked them, were they excited for the Oasis reunion? Now you get a mix of different views, but when there was 9% of people who replied saying that they were very excited. Now you wouldn't maybe say that all very excited people are those who are going to try and buy tickets, but if 9% of Great Britain tried to buy Oasis tickets, that would be 6 million people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no.
So it's going to be tough to get those tickets. And remember, when the Dublin sale goes on, it's going to be an hour earlier than all of the UK dates.
Irish Standard Time, I think, right?
IST, yeah. There was some confusion over that. There was a belief that they'd made a mistake on the time zone, but no, we're in the same time zone. It's just that they'll be earlier. But it means that anyone from around the world, the first tickets that you can try and buy is Dublin. So you could have a lot of British and global people trying to buy those Irish tickets. So it could be potentially one of the most like up there with Taylor Swift and Coldplay's of oversubscribed tickets. So God help the people who work in Ticketmaster on Saturday morning. That's going to be one hell of a job to try and shuffle through that.
Yeah, I'm debating myself whether or not I get tickets. I'm not a big Oasis fan. I like some of their major hits, but I'm not sure I could actually sustain myself for 3 hours in Croke Park or Wembley.
So on the question of buying tickets, you said maybe.
I said maybe. I said maybe. And I think, but I think that the serious point here, though, David, and it kind of highlights the wider issue here, which is, people will have seen examples of, again, this Oasis tour kind of came out of the blue. And there's examples online, for instance, of people who had made bookings in Dublin. um, for next summer. And on the dates when they're playing in Dublin, uh, some examples are the hotels were cancelled and they had to rebook them. And when people looked to rebook, prices went from around €200 a night to over €500 a night. So the question around price gouging and this hospitality sector taking advantage might be the best way to say it of consumers who are looking to simply attend a concert. So there's a bit of pushback on this as well. But the whole question around hospitality, and this is supposedly a sector that's not doing that great or is under pressure, as some of the lobby groups and interest bodies who represent the industry would say. We've seen some high profile, as I mentioned, restaurants that have closed in Dublin in particular over recent months. But data, David, is there any data which kind of covers or gives us a sense of how is this industry and sector doing?
Yeah, so the thing I would look at is employment in the first round, right? So if it is the case that we have more closures of hospitality than we have openings, then we should see the number of people employed in that sector falling. Now, the sector I'm going to talk about is the broad accommodation and food service. So that would include hotels, restaurants, pubs, cafes, that broad sector. So employment as of Q2 of this year, which is the end of June, was just over 182,000. In the prior quarter, in Q1, it was just under 180,000. So by that measure, there are 2,000 extra people working in that sector over the quarter. Now sometimes there's a bit of seasonality to that data. So what if we looked back to Q2 last year? How are we doing on a year-on-year basis? Well, employment was even a bit lower in Q2 of last year. It was 176,000. So it looks like we actually have 6,000 extra people working in that sector in the past year. So there isn't a sign, at least in that data, that the closures, the ones that we are seeing, are only closures. It looks like there are actually implied openings or at least extra hirings within that sector.
Makes sense. So more people working in it. So it seems to be like a growing industry, you could argue.
Yes. It's growing. I mean, the Irish economy overall is growing. I mean, employment in all sectors is now over 2.7 million people, and it was 2.6 million last year. So you're talking about an extra 100,000 people working in the Irish economy. We've continued to add jobs. Now, the challenge though with hospitality is that, well, this can happen in many sectors, is that it's possible that you have extra staff on board, but that everyone is on lower hours. So that can happen as a quirk in the data. You might first see a fall in hours worked in a sector before you see a fall in jobs. And why is that? Firms tend to prefer to keep their staff on board and just cut their hours first before they would then fire people, because it's tough. It's tough for, especially a lot of these businesses are small businesses, and the last thing people want to do is let people go, especially when staff in the round are quite loyal.
Finding good staff too is also really hard.
Yes, that's the other challenge. That was a major phenomenon post-COVID. People hired, and it was tough to hire those people. So letting them go isn't something you want to do. But let's look at total hours. So we can look at the total hours in that sector, and this is measured in million of hours across a given quarter. So in Q1 of this year, there were 4.8 million hours worked in accommodation and food service, but Q2 it rose to 5.1. So we notched 300,000 extra hours worked in that sector. And again, on a year basis, we go back to last year's 4.8. So comparing similar quarters, that takes out any seasonality, there's extra hours. So in the round, at least by those measures alone, accommodation and food services is doing okay. Now, the problem with the hospitality sector, however, is that it faced higher costs because of the cost of living crisis. There were government supports on that front, and those government supports aren't as generous this year as they were last year. That'll be the same for households. The electricity and energy credits won't be as generous. And the VAT rate went up. So up until late last year, it was 9%, and it went back to its old rate of 13.5%. So that is having an impact on some businesses. And there's also the issue of tax warehousing, where some businesses during COVID could defer the tax liabilities. Revenue helped them with that, but now revenue are looking for a payday. They want to be paid, and that is leading to some businesses to struggle as well. So there are kind of danger zones within that sector, but on the round, the sector seems to be doing quite well.
So all the data then, David, and again, I'm looking at the same data as you here. So, it's broken down by quarter. Seasonality is not really an issue here. Every single quarter, across both hours worked and number of people actually employed, is showing a steady increase quarter by quarter. So the debate then, and the question of should this industry get a preferential tax VAT rate back to 9%, do we think it's necessary?
I don't right now. Now, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't ever go again for a 9% VAT rate, but I would describe that policy as our break glass in case of emergency policy.
Okay,
it's
right.
the thing. Yeah, it's the thing you should use whenever those numbers that I quoted begin to turn. So if hours worked begin to be cut, that tells you that firms are cutting back on hours to try and, because they just don't have the business at certain points during the week. And if employment begins to meaningfully notch lower, that's also a sign that you should be reinstating that policy.
Anecdotally, I travel to Dublin quite a bit for work, and I'll come at short notice sometimes, like a week's notice sometimes, and it can actually be quite difficult to find. Obviously, I have some preferred places that I like to stay, and they can be regularly sold out, and not for any good reason. Like there isn't like a big concert again, like Oasis in the city. They can just be not available. Especially in Dublin city centre as well. So just anecdotally, for what it's worth, that's something that I've noticed over the last few months as well, in particular.
And I think hotels are a good measure, because hotels are actually are an all inclusive hospitality thing. So right, so they'll give you the bed, but you also get food in the restaurant. You get your breakfast there, and there tends to be a bar. So if it's sold out, that's also a decent measure of all those other services are being accessed. Now, the closures that we have seen have been, it was Dylan McGrath's Brasserie 66 and Rustic Stone, as standalone restaurants. It may well be the case that the kind of the tourist related sector is doing all right, and we still have decent visitors, and that's keeping that sector good. But then it can be the kind of smaller restaurants and cafes that might be struggling a bit more. That may well be the case. But I do come back to that challenge, which is that the sector's doing well overall. Some of these one-off factors, like the roll-off of COVID supports, the rise in the VAT rate, are going to hit some companies. And the other challenge here is that during COVID, we kept a lot of businesses open. It was the goal of policy was to make sure that just no business goes under, that everyone can stay employed, and that we keep the whole thing going. But in a normal business year, you do have some firms that go under. That can be a bit of a hard message to sell. But like restaurants are notoriously difficult to open and to stay open. Like if you want to burn cash, you want to destroy money, open a restaurant, because it's one of the toughest low margin businesses to do. But it means in a society, in an economy where new businesses are allowed to open, you have to also allow a lot of them to close as well, as some become unpopular and do shut down. So what we might be seeing on those examples is actually just they're part of that life cycle, and it was, there will be others that will open up and take their place and will be more successful because they'll offer something different in line with market trends and everything. Like food tastes change a lot as well. One of the restaurants, Rustic Stone, was steak, and steak has become a lot more expensive to buy because it's energy intensive, and that might just be a trend, and people might move to other food types. Like Mexican restaurants seem to be a lot more popular in Dublin nowadays. So maybe.
Yeah, it's a good point. Some examples of restaurants where they're heavy on a certain food type. Beef, of course. Beef has seen some increase in prices recently, in particular as well. But you're right. Food tastes change. There's a flavor of the month. People expect and want a variety as well, which can also be a challenge, I think, for some restaurants.
Dale, is this topic, in the news in the UK? Because I know the UK had its was it Eat Out to Help Out scheme during COVID, and there was this mood around helping hospitality as well. But is there any similar campaigning on like a VAT rate cut or anything like that?
I mean, it hasn't come across my agenda yet. Now, I'd be curious to see. Of course, London has the benefit of being, a world city. Constantly doesn't necessarily need to do much to attract an international tourist community to it. So it has that kind of natural buoyancy, which keeps definitely the hospitality sector built up. But then you have the wider question of, wider UK, wider England, how are they doing? And it's a good question. I mean, I don't have any data to hand, but certainly one of the things that I have noticed over recent months has been there is talk of the death of the high street. And in fact, there's one person on YouTube, which people who are interested should look into. His name escapes me now. I will think of it afterwards. But basically, his entire YouTube channel is he goes to just high streets across the UK of what was once kind of big, bustling towns. You see northern towns affected by this. You see coastal cities as well and coastal towns. And he basically just walks the high streets and looks at how depleted and depressed they are, and then talks about the wider implications of that, crime and wider antisocial behavior challenges as well. So I'm seeing it in more of a social commentary perspective, but it's a good question, and it's the death of the high street is an issue which I think needs to be talked about a lot more.
It is, and this has come up in relation to the restaurants in Dublin. So there's a great discussion I heard about some Dublin restaurant owners on News Talk, and they were saying that, look, Dublin has become less hospitable to people coming in to it, and the tourist trade is still there. That's great, but a lot of the locals are doing more suburban eating because they're put off by the city. So this also might have a regional element to it as well, whereby London's thriving, but the regions are not. But it might be the reverse in Ireland, that Dublin isn't thriving, but the other suburbs and towns might be holding up reasonably well.
And maybe if you go further than that, maybe like Dublin could be doing well amongst tourists who are visiting it, but let's say those who are actually from Ireland, living in Ireland, are not potentially going into Dublin city centre, and they may be supporting suburban life in particular as well,
Yeah, because that was kind of a COVID trend that everyone was eating more local instead of going into city centre. So,
one of the pieces here, David, just around the VAT rate. So in the UK, there was for COVID in particular, there was a special reduced VAT rate, I believe, that ended when the COVID measures were reduced. But in Ireland, if I'm right in saying that special VAT, that wasn't COVID rated. That was even before COVID, wasn't it?
I think so.
I think so.
Yeah, I'd have to just check that. But yeah, it went from 9 to 13.5. And it's important to remember, like, a lot of other goods and services are at the 23% VAT rate, which is a full 10% higher. So it is already a kind of a carve out for 13.5 to be different for hospitality. It's somewhere between a kind of discretionary good and an essential good. Like, we don't charge any VAT on food because we agree, okay, that is essential. We do put VAT on energy, though, even though energy is quite essential. Discretionary stuff, you buy a new TV, that is 23. So it's about finding, the midpoint for hospitality, whereby, okay, you could just cook your food at home. You could stay with a friend. You don't need to buy a hotel room. There's that attitude to it being discretionary or essential. But so many people are employed in it, and it is the lifeblood of our cities, that you have places that are communal and that are where people go to meet each other. And it's the Irish pub as well. It comes under that too.
It's its own special place. Okay, let's turn to population data, David. I think this is an important piece. So we've had some Population data, which the CSO has released, and it shows that the population of Ireland rose by 98,000 people, which is the largest 12-month increase of people since 2008. But I know, David, one thing you've been talking about as well has been the deficit in housing. And before before any new people are accepted, we do have a deficit of housing in Ireland. For 2022, of 250,000 homes, dwellings across the country, which is it's a huge piece, and I think it just further highlights the housing issue. But just some pieces and some data points I want to just call out here, which I think are quite interesting. So I mentioned population of Ireland rose, and this is for the last 12 months till April of this year. 98,000 people the population rose by. There were 149,000 immigrants, which was a 17-year high. And this was the third successive 12-month period where over 100,000 people immigrated to Ireland. Of those immigrants, 30,000 were returning Irish citizens, 27,000 were other EU citizens, and 5,500 were UK citizens. The remaining 86,000 were citizens of other countries. And one other piece, David, which I know we want to also talk about, which is the migration of Irish citizens. And in that 12-month period, of the Irish citizens, so 30,000 returned to live in Ireland, but 34,700 left. So we're seeing a net exodus of Irish people moving to countries like Australia, Canada, etc. So a lot of data there, David. Where do you want to go?
I'll talk first about the headline numbers. So yeah, the inward migration continues to be quite high. There is still a natural increase in there of just under 20,000. But you're talking about 80% of the increase in our population is migration driven. And the mix of countries within immigration tells us that the tilt is much more towards countries outside of the EU. We did have a wave in the 2000s where a lot of inward migration was from EU countries. That was the accession of Eastern European countries in 2004. So 5, 6, 7, 8 were just a boom for inflows. Nowadays, it's much more beyond. And we see that in work permits data that I've mentioned before, where Irish firms, because the Irish economy is so hot, can't hire within Ireland, can't even hire within the EU jobs market, so they actually are hiring beyond, and so that keeps the pressure on the housing system. That 250,000 deficit of homes that the Housing Commission identified, that is based off the 22 census. So you need to add, and you need to basically
a good bit
notch that number even higher to account for the guts of 200,000 extra people that are now in the country across those 2 years since the census. I mean, we've added basically 2 Galway cities over those 2 years in population. And that means the government is basically running to stand still when it comes to housing. And I think the challenge so we'll have a general election and we're going to have the next government out to the end of the decade. Their challenge, whether it's Fine Gael saying build 250,000 homes or Sinn Féin saying build 300,000, both of those targets, whichever party gets their way in housing, both those targets are at risk of failure if the population continues to notch as higher as it does.
Well, surely those policies are just wrong, full stop, right now. Anyway,
to target a number.
Yeah, for sure. Like as of today, as of 2022, we are just to be in equilibrium, we need 250,000 homes. Yeah. And we're saying that the policy of one of the major government parties right now, Fine Gael, is that they want to build 250,000 homes over the next 5 years. That does not take into account the population increase since then, of which is going to be, we have record numbers here. That's not enough. So we have a policy of the state, and we have a policy of the opposition, by the way, to not build enough homes.
Because both the numbers are too low.
Yeah.
I think it's the Labour Party wants to build 500,000.
Is that even enough? This is the goal.
Yeah, maybe maybe they're closer to the right number. The challenge here is also the mix and the type of homes.
Yes.
Like parties, I'm kind of sympathetic to the idea that parties are going to put a number on this, and they have
For
to,
sure.
because that's what pulls in the attention of voters. But then it does matter, if you're in government, what mix of homes you're going to try
Yeah.
and steer policy towards. One of the challenges that we're now seeing is that the build to rent sector, which actually did provide a lot of new apartments in Dublin over the past while, that their interest in building new stuff is just waning hugely, and it's because we now have the 2% cap on rent increases. But with interest rates a bit higher, it's actually more difficult globally to fund projects like that
Yeah,
as
as
well.
an asset class, it's faced challenges definitely by interest rates for sure.
Yeah, so it's going to be about more traditional brick and mortar house builders
Hmm.
just going off and building 3-bed semis across the place. That's going to really matter. But it's also a question of planning, because we do have a topic coming up now. It's the national planning framework, whereby the government will across the country look at what kind of zoning it's going to do, and the rate of zoning that it does will, in a way, pave, kind of like clear the path for more of those kind of builders to come along and do more projects like that. So that's another thing that's in the pipeline. But there is this topic of the residential zoned tax as well, that you tax zoned land that is being held
Hmm.
and isn't actually being used for housing. It's controversial because some builders will actually get taxed for just having land ready to go, but they don't have the builders ready to go. There's that challenge. And the Green Party are kicking the fuss on that.
Well,
It's its own
we've,
separate.
I mean, just on that topic, and we've touched on this before in recent months, which is this whole question of, we want to build 250,000 homes at the very least. But like, do we have the population of workers to actually make that a reality as well?
Well, there was one of the big CEOs. I can't remember whether it was Glenveagh or Cairns.
Mhm.
One of their execs basically said, "Oh, we do have enough people in the country working in construction," and his point was that just a lot of them are working on building offices and retail and other things, and they actually just need to pivot some people away to housing instead. I mean, the
But
government made a big, yeah.
is that an accurate statement? Because we still need an economy to function, and we still need to build the various infrastructure and commercial properties in order to make the economy is running hot. Employment is great. Those macro points are well sustained, but in order for that economy to be sustained, it requires the necessary building as well. So I'm actually not sure that pivoting and directing workers from that part of the economy to the other, is a great solution, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. You're going to end up needing to build those things eventually
Yeah.
anyway. If you build houses and don't build shops and other infrastructure, the demand will spur it at some point anyway. So I get that point. I guess what a lot of these firms have been doing is hiring abroad. That shows in the work permits data. But that, I guess, maybe speaks to this point being accurate. Actually, there isn't at present in the state enough people to do this. So you have to hire abroad to do it.
Mm-hmm. And then I wonder, because the temporary foreign worker programs are coming under scrutiny. Certainly in Canada as well. Canada in recent months, they've kind of been cut out, I think, from a policy perspective, where the number of temporary foreign workers completely shot up post COVID. They've never realized that this is a problem, and they're effectively moving to more or less shut it down or significantly reduce the number of people who are able to access that program. But the question is more about being targeted. Perhaps this is an area where government should be really targeted on, maybe even putting out a national call or an international call rather for workers to help build Ireland and to help build the country, both the economy and the residential sector as well. And maybe reward the people who come to build Ireland, give them a special permit, give them a special pathway to permanent residency. I think that's the type of policy that, is probably needed here in order to make this a reality. Because quite frankly, I just don't see, as it stands now, I think we have a policy which is not enough, and it's not, and we don't have enough people to build it either. So it's a double failure.
Yeah, and the other challenge is also just the planning system and the planning.
Oh, we
The
haven't even talked about that. Yeah,
yeah,
that's the
yeah,
other.
yeah, and this is just the fact that you can object to housing quite easily,
Willy
and there's a
nilly.
lot of schemes that have ended up in judicial review. So Owen Murphy had the fast track system, but a lot of those projects just ended up in the courts, so it actually wasn't fast at all. Some did were just give it, if you got approval, great, it was fast, but if you ended up in judicial review, your costs on that thing just went higher. And this is something that, so the Attorney General had actually given a speech recently to the Law Library, basically saying to the solicitors, guys, you're making a ton off this, and there's just no way that we can let this continue. So that's what the planning bill is trying to do,
Mm-hmm.
is trying to stop the splurge in judicial reviews that have happened. I was in Galway there last weekend, and the topic of the local data center, I think Apple had a data center plan
Mm-hmm.
there, and it was rejected, and it was rejected because of objections that came from the southeast of the country, from far beyond the region that it was being built in, and
What
those
do you
kinds.
know what the justification was?
Oh, I don't know whether it was kind of habitat or
Too
something like
tall.
that. Yeah. Like there's all kind of reasons why people object. But we are a country where one of the few countries in Europe where you can have third party objections, whereby people from beyond the locality
Sure.
can actually make observations. So high profile stuff, bigger. See, this is the thing, we're doing a lot more larger projects that you want to do, big apartment blocks that can actually like house people quickly. But then they will draw the attention of objectors who are far beyond the locality.
Yeah, absolutely.
So get digital planning bill is a big part of this as well.
Yeah. Okay. Um, Other piece of data then we want to touch on as well from the CSO. It's a pretty data heavy day, which is on earnings. So CSO data is out. New CSO figures show that earnings are up 5.6% over the last 12 months. So average weekly earnings in Ireland rose by 5.6% in the second quarter of the year compared to the same period for last year. So it shows that average weekly earnings reached just over €963, up from 900 and just shy of €912 for the same quarter last year. And average hourly earnings rose by a similar degree, up 5.4%, with the information and communication sector leading the way on that. And I think the piece here, David, is around with good wage growth and inflation low now. With consumer prices rising by about 2.2% over the last 12 months to July of this year. What we're seeing here is effectively real wage growth.
Yep, we are. And this kind of took me by surprise as well, because throughout last year, we had wage growth of around 4.3 or so, but it notched lower towards the end of the year to around 2. Now, that looks to have been a quirk whereby people maybe just didn't get enough overtime and bonuses and stuff like that, because underlying base pay was continuing to rise
Mm-hmm.
around 4. And I was keen to point this out. The CSO, when they do their release, they'll tell you what the overall number is, but when you get to base pay, which excludes overtime and bonuses and all that, that's hidden, and that's kind of, I go off and calculate that myself, and that's what I put in a tweet this week, that we're rising 5.6 on the overall, but 5.2 on the underlying, the base. So actually, it now looks like we actually have more overtime and bonuses and stuff like that, which are actually notching that number higher than the base pay. But the base pay matters because that's the one that people will borrow towards a mortgage. And it was remarkable for everyone, I think, to see that the CSO reported house prices going up around 8% now, year on year, to the
7,
middle
yeah.
of this year. I think 7 was, I think my home did 7, and then the actual
Yeah.
CSO index shows around 8. But whatever it's said around 8, it's really high compared to last year where we were almost flat. Or at least with 22 or 23, we've had more moderate growth in house prices. But the wage increase numbers account for part of this, at least. So if you're growing by 7 and your base pay is up 5, well, every first time buyer can now go out with 5% more borrowing. So that will partly explain the increase in house prices that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. We're also seeing as well, just, I mentioned that consumer prices are 2.2% for the 12 months to July of this year. But I just wonder, David, on this, like, is the real inflation number blunted by some other pieces in that? So, and what I mean by that is, for the likes of, let's say, rents are up on average over. I know DAF released their rental report, and it was over 7% higher. Rents were on average for the second quarter for 2024. The likes of motor insurance up 9% in July compared to the same period for last year. Those are much higher than 2.2, right?
Oh, they are. They are. And then you have the likes of energy, which has been slightly negative.
Mm-hmm.
Food has been relatively flat through that. It depends what your basket of goods is. This is the
Correct.
problem with CPI.
Yes.
It is the average basket, assuming an average person just picks a mix of everything. If you're in a rural area and you have to drive and you got to get your motor insurance and you're younger because you're getting your more expensive motor insurance, that's going to be a bigger CPI for you. But maybe if you're older, you got your mortgage paid, you're not paying rent, and energy is your big cost, you've gotten a good saving there. You might be down year on year. So it really depends on who you are. But for the wages looks at working income. So pensioners are actually reliant on the state to increase their pension every year, and we don't know what that'll be until the budget. But if you're a working person and you're seeing that 5.6% year on year growth, that in the round is going to mean a real wage growth for you. And the big winners in this are people who are renting but in existing tenancies. Now, you mentioned that the DAF rental report rental index is higher. It is. That's for rents in the round.
Yeah.
But any new headline rents are going to be higher as the market goes higher, and they tend to follow wages higher. But if you're in an existing tenancy, you're capped at 2%. And if inflation falls below 2% this year, which it may well do, you'll be capped at whatever the number that is. So if it's 1.5 for the year, you'll only see a rent increase of 1.5, but you may see your wages grow by 5.6. So you're going to have a big growth in your real incomes for those cohort of people. Not everyone can stay in an existing tenancy for long periods of time, but those who do are gonna reap from it.
And of course, the caveat of that being that it's still from a really high place, right?
Yeah, it depends where when you got into a tenancy. You still hear stories of people rolling over tenancies for 5-6 years if they can just shuffle people in and out of sharing it. But look, if you're a couple and you move, you end the whole thing and you start a new one. So you end up jumping higher. So it does depend on what situation you're in.
Exactly. Yeah. The one piece as well, David, just want to touch on because this whole topic of housing policy, and Sinn Féin will release their housing policy in the next month, I believe. But one of the pieces that they have that was in the news this week was regarding an NCT for homes. So NCT for UK listeners, MOT for homes, which would basically be an inspection system for landlords, which would effectively make sure that for, I think it was £100 or €100 a month, €100 per visit or review to make sure that a tenancy basically and that a household meets certain minimum standards.
And just to say, I think their proposal is to do it every 4 years, that you get around to all rental properties every 4. So it'll be 100 quid over 4.
Yeah.
So 25 quid a year onto the cost of being a landlord, let's say.
And they also want to look at overhauling grounds for evictions, removing bans on pets, and a range of other measures as well. So it looks like they want to, these are pretty, certainly for the Irish market, radical plans in order to alter the rental sector within Ireland. Yeah,
it's radical, all right. I'm not so sure that's workable to be able to do an NCT on it. Well, firstly, you need a lot of people to do an NCT of every home within 4 years. There are county councils that already have some inspection people, and it isn't enough right now, admittedly. If you report something, it can be quite slow to get a response, but you could just notch up the enforcement of existing when people report problems being there. But getting around to every house is a challenge. So the analogy I've used for this is a survey that people get when they buy a home. So you buy a house, you have to get a structural survey done. That is to make sure that there aren't any problems with it, so that you don't fork out a big 6-figure sum on a property that has pyrite or some sort of structural problem.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll typically pay around the guts of 500 quid for a professional survey person to go in and inspect the property. So how is it possible to do an adequate inspection of a rental property for €100 a visit when a survey is costing you 5?
Mm-hmm.
That's the big challenge, problem I see with that number, is that it probably understates the overall cost of doing that kind of survey. Now, maybe the taxpayer is going to pony up what it's actually costing the councils to send people around, and that the landlords are just paying some of the cost. That could be it. But I see a flaw there if that's what the Sinn Féin are saying is the actual cost of the whole thing.
Yeah, there are examples in other countries. For example, in the UK, they have the health, housing, and safety rating system. So that basically looks at risks and hazards for residential properties, including privately rented homes. Landlords are required to ensure that their properties meet these standards. Local councils can inspect these properties and, if necessary, take action to force landlords into compliance. Australia as well. Australia has a situation where rental properties must meet minimum standards as well. They also have local authority enforcement on that as well. The costs for these are generally borne by the landlord. Now, of course, the question then relates to, is the ultimate payer the renter, because of the costs then are baked into future rental prices, and would this just increase the cost of the sector? But at the same time, I regardless of the point around the cost, I think that has to be worked out. There needs to be a further professionalization of the rental sector in Ireland, and I think people should have a right to demand a minimum standard. And there are many examples of rental conditions, and you'll even see them online on Daft of properties that are in terrible condition and don't meet the minimum standard that people should expect and demand from their place of living. And I think the genesis of the idea is actually a good one. I think you're right on the cost. €100 seems quite low, and also, who pays for it? But I think the net is a good one.
Well, I think I would agree with notching higher the rate of inspections that are currently being done, because there's good feedback that says there's not much of them being done. But part of the Sinn Féin proposal is that if you fail the NCT, so you fail your car NCT, your car's not allowed to drive the road. If you fail your landlord NCT, you're not allowed to be a landlord. That is what the message from Sinn Féin is. However, here is an incentive that now arises from that. If you want to kick out tenants, but you don't want to serve them notice and deal with the problem of that, well, just don't look after the building and make sure it fails the NCT when it comes around, and then you'll be able to kick the people out, because you're not allowed to be a landlord anymore. This is the challenge. Like, do you actually create a small bit of vacancy and eviction even from that policy? Because the harder you go, the more of that sort of case you end up with.
Well, that's where enforcement happens, right? If you advertise your property, someone rents it, well, then you have to maintain it to that standard that it once was, right?
Yeah, well, certainly you'd be prohibited on future listings is the idea, I guess. Like, a certain property would then be blacklisted until it could make its changes and then get re-inspected.
I think for the tenants who are living there right now, I think there's there's other countries who do this, where there is an enforcement requirement where you have to basically make the home fit for purpose and right again, given that there's a tenancy currently active.
Oh, I get you. Sorry. So the people would stay in place.
Yeah, like then... it's not just a case of like, okay, it's not fit for purpose. I'm not going to fix it. Get out. I think because it's a live contract. It's no. You have to fix this and make it fit for purpose again, which is what we originally agreed in the tenancy agreement.
Yes. Okay. So maybe the balance of powers is back in the renter's hands then, whereby they may not be they may have a right to actually just not pay the rent then until it's fixed.
Or
that could tilt the balance back in their favor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it was a survey done to tenants 2 or 3 years ago, and I found that 10% of tenants have at some point faced a range of problems in rentals, including mold, for example. So there are crappy tenants out there, or crappy landlords out there that just aren't looking after places. The UK, Dale, they're looking to bring in, I think, a minimum C standard on rentals by 2030 as well. Yeah, and that was just in the commentary on, okay, is being a landlord attractive or not? And if you have a G-rated property, I'm sure that isn't.
No.
But that is about getting minimum standards in there. Certainly Ireland probably should look at something around the BER and trying to get some of the GF and like really cold and dingy places out of the system, but gradually as well, because look, we've lost a lot of small landlords, so you don't want to drive them out too.
No, and this has to be, and this is where balance comes into everything, right? It has to be, people have the right to rent a home that's of a minimum standard. People also have a right to make a bit of a return off letting out their space as well. So I think balance is the key, is a word of the word of the day here, maybe, David, is what we can say. On that note, we have run out of time. So thanks again for listening and watching. If you did like this podcast, again, please like it, please share it, and also please give us a follow. It is on all major podcast platforms that you can listen to. We're also available on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. Thanks again for watching. Good to be back, David, from vacation. I hope you get one booked soon as well, and look forward to chatting to you again next week.
See you soon.